Hello, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. This is Nels Davis, author of the Secret Product Manager Handbook. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling and walk through a cheat sheet that I've recently created and that you can download. There's a link down below in the show notes. You know, as a business person, whether you're a product manager like me or a marketer or an innovator or a salesperson, a lot of your success consists of persuading other people to do things, whether that's to fund your project or to buy your product or to read your ad if you're a marketer. Now, if you want to be persuasive, you need to get good at storytelling because stories have this sort of superpower to get through the brain's barrier. So we have this brain barrier that the brain is resisting new information, and storytelling, you know, once upon a time, for example, it's able to leap over that barrier and get into the listener's brain or whatever. Stories have this emotional resonance that you need. And if you want to get good at persuasion, you need to get good at stories. There's a formula for telling great, emotionally compelling stories. This involves a pretty simple structure and asking the right questions. And these stories that you're going to develop in this way are not going to win you a Nobel Prize or get you an Oscar, but they are going to differentiate you and your product from your competitors. And your stories are just going to be a lot better if you take examples from these. So I'm going to talk about that. We're going to get right into it in a minute here. You know, excellent storytelling, particularly if you're a product manager, well, a product marketer as well, can be a real superpower. But, you know, we're not all born with it. And so even though we really need to be able to do all this different kind of pitching, you need to maybe learn how to tell stories. And that's what this simple cheat sheet is about. Now, this cheat sheet's focused on customer success stories, but a very similar set of approaches, a structure, and questions work for your prospect stories. In fact, your prospect story is kind of a subset of your customer success story. And then we have to tell stories about ourselves as well. Like if we're looking for a new job, we need to be able to tell the stories about how we were successful as product managers. So that superpower capability is very important. Now, I mentioned there's about 3 basic stories that we need to have in our product management arsenal. We need the customer story, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. We need the prospect story, which is similar, but instead of being a happy outcome story, it's a tragedy. Now, both of these are used a lot in sales, and I'll do a future video to talk about exactly how to apply these stories in a sales situation, but both are really powerful in a sales situation. The prospect story is really important for pitching a new product idea. For example, if you want to develop a new product, if you have an idea for a new product that you think your company should fund, well, the prospect story is the way you're going to convince them about that. The prospect is having these terrible problems, and it's a tragedy unless we come up with a solution. And then, of course, as I mentioned, your own story, very important. So let's get started on the walkthrough for this cheat sheet. So as I mentioned, there's a link for the cheat sheet down below, and I've got the cheat sheet here in this screen. So let me just go to this, and it's right over here. So I have a slightly different view of stuff than you do. So this is, again, the title of the customer story template and how to use it. And so we're going to just start working through it. Now, the opening part of this presentation was really about why storytelling is so important. So I've sort of replicated this already. And, oops, lost my window. I've got all these windows open. Okay, so this is really a little bit of a reiteration of why storytelling, but let's talk about the basic story structure. So this is getting into the actual meat of the situation. Let me zoom in a little bit here so we can look at this a little bit better. So basically, the basic story structure, as you've probably heard this, the stories need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, I've heard that, of course, for many years, and I've read a lot of books about storytelling, but nobody exactly told me, I thought, what goes in the beginning and middle and end. So I learned this great structure that's called the PSR, problem, solution, results. And essentially the mapping is really straightforward. And it's, again, this is in the cheat sheet. So if you get the cheat sheet, you can see this. The mapping is very simple. The beginning of the story is about a problem, some problem that the customer is experiencing that's causing them a lot of pain. And a lot of angst, and it might have business implications, and it might have personal implications as well. In the middle of the story, you talk about the solution, what the customer did to try to find a solution. And of course, the end of the solution section, the end of that middle section is, oh, they found your solution. They found your product. And then you move into the results section, the end of the story. And that's all about the business and personal results that the customer got as a result of implementing your solution, right? So that's the basic structure of a customer success story. I think we're all probably sort of familiar with that. Actually, one of the big problems that lots of these customer stories have, and if you go around like to different companies' websites and look at their customer success stories, most of the stories are about the business problems and business results, but those turn out to not be very emotionally compelling. So you have to think about the emotional compelling part of this customer's challenge, of the problem. And of course, when you get to the results, you want to talk about emotionally compelling results as well. So the first part of the story is the problem, right, as I've got here. And when you're thinking about persuasion has both emotional and rational components, persuasion and storytelling. Remember that I had that metaphor of the getting over that barrier? Well, a lot of that barrier comes from having emotional components in your story. That's what actually makes stories compelling, is this emotional stuff. And so you need to find out some of the things that made this problem for the customer emotionally resonant, as well as the impact of the problem on the business. So the way you do that is you ask the right sets of questions. And so I've got a set of customer story discovery questions here in the cheat sheet. So what was the problem you were having? So that's the basic question, of course. But why was the problem we're solving? And this is probably going to have some business aspects, and it might also have some personal aspects. What bad things were happening to the business or were going to happen if the problem wasn't solved? Now, this can have both emotionally compelling aspects and just pure business aspects. But for example, if your sales are declining and they should be going up, then the business impact of of declining sales over time is that your company goes out of business. Well, that's a pretty dire situation. And you're certainly allowed to use that as part of your story if that's actually happening. If your customers' sales were declining, well, eventually that's going to be really bad news for the customer. Probably really bad news it's going to be bad news for the business, probably going to be really bad news for the customer. He or she might lose his or her job, so on and so forth. Now, you can also drill specifically into this with asking about questions like what personal related bad things were happening. Like, did they have to work overtime? Were they highly stressed? Were they making a lot of mistakes? And were they having to miss all their kids' baseball games? There's all kinds of different directions you can go. And you also want to understand what solutions they tried to solve this problem and why those solutions didn't work. Now, you're going to use partly that answer in the solutions portion, but it's part of this drilling down as well. Because part of the reason you want to ask the solutions question is not just to validate that they had this problem and the importance of the problem, but that the problem was bad enough that they actually went out and looked for solutions. Now, you're going to use that solution search in the middle part of the story, but you are going to use the fact that they searched for solutions to validate just how bad this problem was. Now, you can modify these questions. Of course, this is just an example of some questions that you can ask. But the other thing about this is, for every one of the answers that you get, probably your best response is, oh, and then what? Or tell me more. Because oftentimes the first answer you're going to get is going to be a little bit pro forma. What was the problem you were having? Well, all of our projects were late. Oh, tell me more. That's going to help your customer start to drill down into what was really going on deeper and deeper. And you can also then say, oh, and then what happened if all of your projects are late? Well, a bunch of people may be getting fired, or you're losing money, whatever it might be. But you want to discover that. And that's where you're also going to get not just details that you wouldn't otherwise get if you weren't drilling down, but you also may start to get into some of the emotional components of this problem for that customer. So that's the first section of the story, the problem. Let's move on. I overshot. So the solution. Goodness. Having a little trouble navigating my thing here. Okay, so the solution. This is the part that we technologists really like. We like the solution. Because we're technologists, and I'm assuming that most of us product managers, we're kind of technical. We like the technology. We're in the business because we love technology. We're also in the business, of course, because we love our customers and we want to solve problems. But because we're technologists, we're very enthused about the solution component. That's our product, in fact. Our product is the solution to this problem that the customer had. And so we want to talk a lot about that. But you have to remember that you're actually trying to focus on what the customer needs to know or what the prospect needs to know about this customer's success. And they probably don't need to know that much detail about your product. They're going to get that in any case. But what they do need to know, in particular for the case of a customer success story, is they need to know what this customer tried to do to solve the problem before they found your solution. And so you can ask questions like, what did you do to try to solve this problem? And again, don't forget, then what or tell me more. How did the solutions you tried not work? Obviously, if they came to you but had already tried to solve the problem, for some reason the solutions they tried before were not good. And so you want to understand what it is that made those solutions bad and makes your solutions better for that prospect or that customer, because you're going to want to be able to tell that same story later on to your prospects, or you're going to want to give the sales team these answers so that they can then use the same stories later on when they're talking to prospects. Now, sometimes what happens is the customer actually discovers a deeper problem underlying the original problem. And that deeper problem is what actually needs to be solved, not the original problem that they had. This can sometimes make a really powerful story. It's a little bit trickier, and it works really well for your personal stories. And when I do the cheat sheet on personal stories, I'll go into that in great detail. But for example, I'll just give you a real quick example of this deeper problem, from a personal story, but just so you have a sense of what it might look like. I was asked by some sales engineers to help them improve the agile demo for a certain product. But it turned out that what was really going wrong with our demos, and the reason that we were missing sales quota a lot, was that the whole demo was focused about us and our product as opposed to how the product solved the prospect's problem. Once they started talking about you and asking questions and using discovery information as they showed the demo, and for example, saying, let me show you how our product solves this problem that you mentioned in our discovery call, suddenly our sales skyrocketed. So the original problem wasn't the agile demo per se. It was that we were demoing all wrong, and we were demoing about our stuff instead of about the prospect's problem. So that's just an example of where you might find an underlying problem that's different from the real problem. That sometimes happens in customer stories as well. So, but what you want to get to, though, is that the ultimate last sentence really of the solution section should be, oh, and the customer found our product and it solved their problem. Something along those lines. It might not just be a single sentence, but they went through all this whole quest of looking for a solution, and then they found us and we solved their problem. Now, one thing that can also happen in the solution section is you can a little bit use this as you are maybe the guide for the customer to find their solution as well. So it may be about them searching for a solution and failing, and then us stepping in and guiding them to the final solution or to the correct solution, which was our product. So sometimes you can tie yourself in there as the guide, or sometimes you can just let the customer be the full hero of the story. They're always the hero of the customer story anyway, but whether you sort of position yourself as the guide in that, or just that you are the solution and the customer found you, those are some choices that you can make. So let's move on to the next section. The results. This is about what happens once the customer has found your solution and implemented it and is very happy and has great results. And so there's going to be a couple things to think about here. One is that you want not just business results, but personal results. Now, think back to the problem statement. The problem statement had some business issues, business problems that were causing, potentially dire ones like the company going out of business, but also some personal problems like maybe the customer was going to lose his or her job. And so what you want to do is for the components of the problem that you set up in the first part of the story, you want to kind of pay off all of those components in the results. So if you had a business problem where the company wasn't making sales quota, then part of the results is going to be, and now we make quota every quarter, or we beat quota every quarter. If there was an issue where, man, I was worried I was going to lose my job, in the results you want to say, not only did I keep my job, but I got a promotion. You can see how you want to tie those things back and forth. This is very satisfying to people for stories to tie all the loose ends up. And in fact, if you don't have a result that's related to a component of your problem, you might not want to mention that component in the first place, because it's going to make the story weaker if you say there's part of this problem and you don't at the end say that that problem was solved, or that the results included making that part of the problem go away. So some of the questions that you can use here: what business results did you get from the solution? Obviously, these can be both quantitative and qualitative, but that's focused on the business. And again, business results are not necessarily that emotionally compelling unless they're huge. If they're a factor of 10 improvement in revenues, that's really big. If they're a 20% improvement in revenues, that's a nice to have, but you better have some other emotional stuff coming in there as well. Another one: what work-related personal results did you experience? Maybe the customer got a raise, or they got a promotion, or they became known as the expert on a particular area within their company, or they got to get home and see their kids baseball games, right? So those are sort of non-work related personal results. Maybe they got home for dinner, got to see their kids baseball game. One of the customer stories that I really loved, a customer said, before this was for a client, before my client's solution, he was having real trouble sleeping because he wasn't sure that things were going to work out, and so he wasn't sleeping well. And then once my client's solution was implemented, he slept really well. And so that was a really significant kind of personal outcome, personal result from having this solution implemented, was that he slept better. He literally slept better. It's a great story. And it's an example of the type of thing that you can tie into your story. Now, you'd, of course, in the initial problem statement of that customer story, you would say, oh, my customer wasn't sleeping well. He was so worried about what was going on. And then in the end, you say, and now he gets a full night's sleep every night. Something like that. So those are the fundamental components: the problem, the solution, the results. Those are some questions to help you assess that. Now, the next piece here is to think about your opening for your story. And this is a topic that I call the vertical takeoff. That's actually not my term, and I learned that from somebody else, but I think it's really good. So the vertical takeoff is essentially the idea of starting in the action. If you're familiar with a James Bond movie, James Bond movies always start with this big action scene. And, usually it's James Bond finishing up his previous assignment before he starts on the new assignment that the movie is all about. Now, typically, when you're talking about a customer success story, the vertical takeoff is probably more related to the actual problem that you're going to talk about in your story. Unlike James Bond, where we're not making movies here. We're making little short stories about our customers and their success. But what you want to do is you want to start in the action. You don't want to set up stuff with a bunch of facts and a bunch of scenarios. What you want to do, and I'll give you an example of starting in the action. My company's sales were tanking. Okay, that's a vertical takeoff. My company's sales were tanking. That sounds like my company is in really bad straits. Like, terrible things are going to happen. If they keep happening, it's really going to be bad for my company. And so I give you a little bit of some insight into how to structure, or the two basic structures for your vertical takeoff. One of them is, a bad thing is going to happen to me or to my company if we don't do something about it soon. Or, this bad thing is happening over and over again and I don't know how to stop it, but I must. This is the second example there is my company's sales were tanking. That is a thing that's happening over and over again. If I don't stop it, bad things are going to happen. So those are the types of things, and some examples here. It had gotten to the point where I couldn't sleep at night. That's that story that I already mentioned. So that is a great thing to start a story with. I can't sleep because I'm so stressed about this thing that's going wrong and I don't know what to do about it. Or if things don't change and fast, the company was going to go out of business. So those are examples of vertical takeoff. So you want to see if you can come up with one of those vertical takeoff statements. And that's going to make your story a lot stronger. It's going to make it much more engaging from the outset. Now, I have a page in here that I call the Litmus Test. So this is the way that you can test to see if you've got all the components of the story that you need. So what I recommend doing is you go out and ask these questions of your customer. So you've got a successful customer. You go and interview that customer and you ask all these questions. And you make sure to ask the questions about the personal goals, the personal problems, because those are the ones that are going to give you emotional heft. You ask about, were you going to be fired? Were you going to lose your job? What happened afterwards? Oh, I got a promotion. Did you get a promotion? Did you get recognized? You ask all these questions so that you can have all the components. Then my suggestion is you write the story down. And I've got a template in the back that you can actually type right into in the PDF to help you tell your story. So once you've written down this first story, I would recommend practicing it out loud a few times and seeing if you really got it all holding together. And if you're kind of a shy and quiet person like I used to be, you want to make sure that it should seem a little bit outrageous to you if you're a little bit shy and quiet. If you're already a salesperson type or something like that, it probably won't seem outrageous to have all this component in there. But if you're if you were started as an engineer and you moved into product management from engineering, you might feel like this story that you've structured is a little outrageous because you're talking about emotions and you're talking about really bad things that might happen if this thing continued on and on. Even if maybe the company wasn't immediately, literally about to fall off the cliff, you're going to set it up in that story so it sounds like that. Because if the problem wasn't fixed, that is what would eventually happen, right? The company would go out of business. So you want to write it down, you want to practice it a little bit, and then here's a set of questions you can use to assess the story. So is the problem dire? Does it sound really terrible? Is it sound like something that is worth listening to, a story that is worth listening to? So many of the customer success stories that you read are they seem watered down. Even though if you read between the lines, you probably can recognize that, oh, this customer was headed for a bad situation if this problem wasn't solved, but it doesn't come through explicitly in the story. And that's an opportunity lost because it makes the story boring. You don't want your stories to be boring. The way you keep them from being boring is you make the problem dire, you make the search for the solution challenging, and you make the results outstanding. So does your description of the problem have both personal and business impact? Another question, do you have a vertical takeoff? Is the solution compact? Is it 4 or 5 sentences, but it's very compelling? Does the solution leave your listener wanting more details? Now, this is often the case when you're presenting a story verbally, is you actually want the telling of the story to result in the prospect or whoever you're telling to come back and say, I'd really like to hear more about how that problem was solved with your solution. That's your goal. You want them to ask a question in response. Do the results all tie back to the problem? That's a really important thing. Do you have emotionally resonant results, both personally meaningful and potentially really big business impact? But again, that needs to kind of be a factor of 10 kind of impact to make the business results really meaningful. But you do need to have some business results. So one of the mantras that you use about storytelling is that, and considering that a lot of this storytelling is used in the context of sales, the mantra is people make decisions emotionally, but then they justify them rationally. So what does this mean for your storytelling? Well, it means your stories need to be really emotionally compelling, but it means they also need to have rational justification type of components like quantitative business results. And so that's what you want to be thinking about as you develop these stories. So that is the main body of the template. Let's take a look. The next thing to do is to develop and polish these stories. So I talked already about practicing. Practicing your stories makes a huge difference. They just get better and better as you practice them, typically. And particularly the first few practices make them a lot better. You might want to consider reading it out loud to somebody else, or even just out in the air, and that will often help you hear problems in the story or notice things that you could improve. Of course, you need to have lots of other stories. can't finish with just one. So you're going to talk to other customers, get their stories, things like that. Make sure to ask all these leading questions, like what would have happened if this problem hadn't been solved. And then you also can take a look at all my other articles and podcasts and videos on storytelling. Some of them are linked in the show notes below. Things like 2 stories every product manager must be able to tell, which was a podcast episode. And if you have the cheat sheet, these are actually links, so you can click on them and it will take you right to those links. So that is the quick walkthrough. Let me finally show you one more thing in here. So there's a little bit about me, but then the final piece here is the template. And I've got 4 copies of this template in here. And it's essentially, you can click right into these boxes and type your stories right in there. So your customer, Acme machine, machining, whatever. You can type in your customer stories in there. As I said, there's 4 copies of this template, and you can just go right through that and fill in those templates with your stories. And of course, you don't have to use this template. I've given you enough information. You can put it into a Word doc or a Google Doc or a PowerPoint, whatever you want to do. But in case you just want to work right in here, you can use this, and this will give you prompts and things on how to create your story. So that is the quick walkthrough of the story template, and hopefully you found that useful and interesting. If you have any questions about the story template or anything else, you can certainly leave them down in the show notes, leave them down in the comments below, and I will answer them and get back to you. Let me check over here. No live comments at the moment, so that's good to know. So let me just finish up here. So that's what I wanted to share today, just a walkthrough of that cheat sheet and template. Hopefully that was useful and interesting. And if you have, as I say, if you have any questions, get back to me. Hopefully you'll join me on the channel for another live video in the future, and that would be great. I do them every Monday night, almost every Monday night, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time, and you can always find out if there's one scheduled by going to my YouTube channel, and there's links for all that stuff down below. So that's it for presentation. Consider taking a look at some of my other videos, and there should be some other videos popping up here any minute now. Anyway, that's it. I will talk to you again next week. Hope you enjoy this. Bye-bye.